that was. If we are currently live, welcome everybody to our weekly live stream. Give me just a second to get loaded up here and let me know if everything is sounding good. I see we got 23 people watching right now. Looks like we're on. So welcome everybody. It is just me today. There is no Logan. That is because he is trying to do a speed run of the Oregon Trail. And as you all know, that might take a little while. So if you don't already, make sure to follow him on Twitch. Someone says the sound is good. That's good to know. For those of you who are new to our live stream, we do this every single Sunday at 8:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And our format is something like we go over some genus news and or genus relative beer news. We also then talk about some beers of the week where we break down a style and talk about our favorite, or at least what we like to use for in the moment: yeast, hops, malt, and sometimes water profile. Then we go into two discussion topics, and we usually like to finish out with a little bit of Q&A. So you'll have a chance to interact with us and ask questions at the very end. Seeing if I can multitask here. That's not going to work. And get both my screens uploaded. I got your comments right there. What's to look for Logan? I don't understand that. Hey, look, things are already popping up. Cool. Got my computer ready to go. Got my outline ready to go. Let's jump into it. Also, if you are tuning into the podcast, welcome. This is a live stream that we do every Sunday on YouTube and then turn into podcast form. So let's start off with our genus news. We did a series of seltzer trials, which I am super excited about. We kind of have a blanket seltzer recipe / seltzer profile. And what we ended up doing with that is, first of all, going with that profile and doing a side-by-side yeast. So we're trying to figure out ways to get really interesting, almost beer-like flavors into seltzer without completely ruining the essence of seltzer. But also we think that all the people that are doing just seltzers that are super neutral with some sort of a flavor to them, that gets kind of boring, and doesn't really scream us / what we want to do. So we are trying to put a little funk, a little nice spin on those seltzers. And yeah, that is something that is going on. We should have those done this week, actually. They're all done fermenting. We're just going through the clarifying steps. Then we're going to get those into kegs and do some flavorings on some of them maybe, although one of them's tasting really good by itself, which I'm super excited about. So we'll be doing a video on that. We also just got in the Cannular Pro. Super excited about that. That is the next step up from the Cannular. I skeptically bought the Cannular, the regular Cannular, over a year ago now. And it's worked like a charm for us. And that is basically a can steamer that does 16 or 12 ounce cans, and you can pour your beers off tap and then put beers in cans to go. Great for our tap room customers. But with the Pro, it's a larger model that's supposed to be a little bit more industrious, and it's automated. And so instead of having a lever that you pull back and forth, it takes the guesswork out of that. You just have to push some buttons and it does its thing. We also got a Nuka Taps, made by the same company as the Cannular. It's a Kegland product. Nuka Taps are the subsequent, the thing that came after Inner Taps. And so basically the same people that made Inner Taps decided that they can make them a little bit better, and they designed Nuka Taps. So I'll be doing a video later on this week kind of breaking down those Nuka Taps and telling you how those go. We also got a Vienna Lager brewed. That was a nice large batch that took us 3 days to brew because we brew on a 50-gallon system here, and then the batch was 5-barrel batch. So that took a while, but it's tasting super, super good. And we're busting out all the stops with doing this. I also, I think we mentioned 1 or 2 weeks ago that I brought in a bunch of enzymes from White Labs, and those enzymes are really good at kind of maximizing your mash profile and making sure that you're getting some good stuff off of there. And so yeah, we used all those. We got super, super high efficiency. So for our 5-barrel batch, I think when we were aiming for an OG of like 1055, we ended up somewhere between 1065 and 1070. So our strategy from talking about it is going to be to keg off about a barrel of that, and then actually keg off the barrel as like a more of a box style beer, a heavier version, and then dilute back down to a Vienna Lager strength, and hopefully that works out. We also got news that I think everyone got news, but the Blickman G4 is coming. The Blickman G4 is their response to, I think, the Spikes Flex Plus systems. Basically, it is a modular conical style fermenter with tri-clamps pretty much everywhere, so you can incorporate whatever equipment that you already have. You can also use their spunding valves and a bunch of different stuff to make them more utilitous and more consistent than some of the less expensive things that you can get in the conical world. So that is it for our beer news. Looks like we got 50 people watching. Just in time for our beer of the week. Bump, 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 beer of the week. Now it's way better without Logan. I think we can all agree. My singing voice is perfect. This beer of the week is going to be a New England style IPA. And I know we've done this before, but I wanted to do the New England style IPA because it is, we got in a new product that I'll kind of go over in our topic number 1. But let's just break down the New England style IPA by itself before jumping into the ingredients of the week. New England IPA. So a New England IPA, for those of you who don't know, is basically it's what everyone's craving with these hazies, these juicy styles, where you're taking away some of the sharp bitterness that you get off of those West Coast style IPAs, and you're dialing that back and substituting it for a nice juicy profile. So instead of having a more balanced hop addition throughout the entire boiling process, we don't front load any of our hops. We don't put any towards the boil. We actually save all those for the whirlpool, where you'll get some bitterness, but a lot of the fruit characteristics of the hops tend to pop out. What you're left with is a lower IBU, kind of creamier, sweeter tasting beverage that really shows off the varieties of the hops. It's more varietal specific than something like a West Coast, where you're kind of going to get a more balanced profile, maybe leaning towards some of the varieties that you're using, but a lot of the standard aggressive bitterness that you're used to with IPAs. New England IPAs are also often hazy. They have a lot of proteins in them, and those proteins kind of help build haze. The haze shouldn't come a lot from yeast, and that's one thing that we tell people a lot, is that you shouldn't be just trying to get that haze with a lower flocculating yeast or a yeast that stays in suspension. So we actually like to have most of that haze come from either proteins from the malts or actually the hop oils. If you use enough hops, especially in the whirlpool or a dry hop, you can actually get really kind of oily look to the beer, and that's just those hop oils kind of popping out. No way, man. I crave quads and barley wines. Is that because we have one of those behind? We have a barley wine behind us. So for our malt of the week, and this is a malt that we've said before, this is kind of a recycled beer of the week, but our malt of the week is Chit malt, and that is for 2 different reasons. First of all, Chit is a really good bodybuilding malt. It's an undermodified malt, so it has a lot of the proteins that you're looking for with a hazy style. And also, Chit is high in enzymes, meaning it's going to help convert a lot of the extra starches and a lot of the extra bodybuilding proteins and stuff that you have from using high adjuncts, because a hazy IPA is a very high adjunct beer. You're going to be using a lot of flaked oats, a lot of flaked wheat, and so having another bodybuilding adjunct that also has enzymes in them is a great option. I also like to use a little bit of oat malt in mine. That way it's not all just like some base malt and then a lot of flaked stuff, because that can, first of all, make for a gummy mash, and second of all, it can make it so that you can get lower conversions. So a little bit of oat malt, a little bit of chip malt. That's my go-to for malt of the week. My hop of the week is, it's actually a hop that my hop of the week is actually a new product that we just got in, and that's why I wanted to do a New England style or a hazy style IPA for this week's beer of the week, and that is Incognito. Incognito is made by Haas, which Haas is a hop company out of Germany. And what it is it's a hop extract that is type specific, and it is highly flowable and highly soluble. So something that is pretty new to hop extracts is something that is highly flowable. A lot of hop extracts right now you have to heat up, and they don't do a great job of dissolving in liquid right off the bat, because they are oils, and oils and waters don't like to mix. And so what Incognito did is it took a medium in there and it actually made it so that the extract can flow really easily, so you don't have to necessarily heat it up before pouring it into your whirlpool, and it's highly soluble. So if you're just throwing it into the whirlpool, which is where you're supposed to use it, it's going to dissolve very quickly, so you don't have to worry about some of it settling to the bottom and losing what is a pretty expensive product in your wort. So the one that we brought in is going to be Equinaut, and we'll be using that for New England in the very, very near future. But the hop of the week is more about the fact that we have the incognito and how to use it. So when using incognito, the idea is you're just adding it to the whirlpool and you're letting it sit there. That should be all you need to do. And the reason that this is going to work really well for a New England style IPA, especially like on our bigger system that we have downtown, is we're reducing the amount of hop loss that comes from the plant matter from hops absorbing liquid. So we're ending up with more beer, which means more profit in the final product. We get more sellable stuff at the very end. And then also we've had a little issue when we're doing really hoppy beers, if we can't fully whirlpool them out or like get the trub dam to block out everything in the whirlpool, we've had a problem with the plate chiller down there actually clogging. So using the incognito is really nice because obviously there's no plant matter to help clog that plate chiller. And so it should kind of reduce the risk of stuff that we don't want happening down there. The reason that that's an issue down there is if the plate chiller clogs, and this is the same for any of you who have counterflow chillers, or if you have a lot of systems with your pumps that go from your kettle to your fermenter, is if you have, let's say, a big whirlpool addition and then your chiller clogs, it takes a lot longer to either transfer through the chiller or to chill down your beer. And that makes it so that your whirlpool additions turn into more bittering additions. You end up losing volatiles, you end up losing aroma, and you end up with a more bitter and less overall appealing beer. So that is incognito. If you've got any questions on incognito, let me know. I'm going to take a little water break. It's always hard doing this solo because there's not somebody else to fill the silent space whenever I am not talking, like I want to take a drink of water, I want to look something up. Moving on, our yeast of the week. Yeast of the week is going to be House. I've actually been loving House. This is the British Ale strain, classic SO4 style strain for all my New England Hazy IPAs. It's a relatively neutral strain, so it's really good for letting those hops kind of push forward, but it also isn't bright and tinny. It's something like Chico would be, or a lot of the American ale strains. So House is really good because it's going to be slightly malt leaning. It leaves a generally sweeter profile on the base, which really amplifies the fruitiness that you want from using heavy whirlpool hops, like a lot of those juicinesses that you can get off of hops. So that's House from Imperial as our yeast of the week. And then as for water profile is, as a lot of you have heard, it's going to be higher chloride to sulfate ratio, and you can go up to 5-to-1. 5 parts chloride to 1 part sulfate. So that other than that, it's going to be relatively neutral in terms of the overall minerality. Probably nothing more than like 120 parts per million in the bicarbonate, calcium, all that levels. But the biggest thing is just making sure that you have that high sulfate to chloride ratio. And that is it for our beer of the week. Let me scroll through real quick and see if we've got any questions on that so I can gather myself a little bit. What's Logan's Twitch handle? I actually forget. What's to look for Logan? It's something about a Sasquatch. But yeah, he'll be speed running Oregon Trail and then speed running Mario Kart. Or not Mario Kart, Super Mario 3. Just got my Anvil Foundry, SS Brew Bucket, and Keg CO2 running the John Palmer Hello World Cincinnati Pale Ale. Nice. Do we charge extra for cans? No, we don't. We actually, if it's pre-made in cans, we will discount those. But for the most part, what we do is the cans themselves, 16-ounce cans, are pint price out the door. And then if you get more than one, like if you get a 4-pack, we have a discount. If you get a 6-pack, it's a bigger discount. If you get a 12-pack, it's a bigger discount. So overall, what the cans cost us is probably about 50 cents a can. So we just kind of eat that. When is Incognito going to be available for homebrewers? That is a great question. So Incognito I could only get it in a size that's actually bigger than I need. I think at the maximum strength that you want to use the Incognito, it's still good for 8 barrels, the size that I got. And our brew house downtown is 7 barrels, and we're usually making 6 barrels with it. So what we're going to have to do is actually split it up a little bit, use some downtown, and then bring it immediately back here, and then use some here. I thought about, because we have syringes here, so I thought about actually trying to syringe up a couple and give them to homebrewers to try out here, but no one's really doing that. Dun, 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 dun. All right, caught up on questions. Let's go to topic number 1. You guys have probably heard me a lot lately talking about enzymes, and that is because we have really, really fallen in love with enzymes and have been using them quite a bit. So we're going to be talking about enzymes. We're going to be talking about special nutrients, and then, of course, the incognito. All new ingredients that are made by science to help brewers make better and more consistent beer. The one that I've been using a lot as kind of a catch-all is called, from White Labs, it's called, OptiMash. And from other companies, it's called Amylex 4T. And I actually just got an email from a company called Novozyme that makes their own version. And what that's good for is it breaks down higher starches it's really, really temperature tolerant. And so it's an enzyme that can break down higher starches at a range of temperatures. You don't have to worry about if you accidentally mash in at too high of a temperature and you end up with like killing off all your enzymes. Guess I don't have it in this email. But theoretically, with an enzyme like this, you can match close to 100% all adjuncts. So Logan and I have actually tossed around the idea of, whoa, that's weird. Come on, Google. I just popped up like regular Google, and the first thing that advertises says, go incognito. Wonder if they're listening to me. They're spies. But Logan and I have tossed around the idea of using like 100% adjunct. We've thought about doing something like 100% corn beer or 100% Carapils beer, because most of you know I don't like Carapils, and that would just be funny to break down all the Carapils starches with an enzyme. But yeah, so from it's called OptiMash from White Labs, and so that's basically a mash enzyme that makes it so that no matter what temperature you're at, you can go ahead and get your full conversion, even if you mash too high. It kind of takes the guesswork out of it. And they have another one called ViscoBuster. ViscoBuster, what that is a beta-glucanase enzyme. So it breaks down beta-glucans, which is the gumminess in your mash. And that gumminess in your mash, what it does is it makes it so that you get channeling, or you get not a good rinse off all your mash grains. So something like ViscoBuster will make it so that you'll get more efficiency just because the flowability through your grain bed is higher. So the two things that we've been using in pretty much every beer since I got these enzymes in is the ViscoBuster and OptiMash. Other enzymes that we've been using, you've probably heard of AMG. AMG is amyloglucosidase, and that is the enzyme that is used to make brut IPAs. But it also has a lot of utility, and probably before the brut style IPA was used in high alcohol beers. So a great example, if you look behind me, we have Darwin's Dilemma, which is a 10.9% imperial barley wine. Now, that thing by itself, it stalled out at 1035, 1.035 final gravity, which would have made it about 9.5% alcohol. But once the majority of its fermentation was done, I went ahead and added a little bit of extra yeast nutrient or yeast energizer, and I had added some amyloglucosidase, some AMG. Excuse me. That brought the final gravity of the Darwin's Dilemma barley wine down to 1.012, which turned it into a 10.9% barley wine. So using some AMG is actually a really good strategy in those high alcohol beers, because that AMG will make it so that you can bring up that total alcohol level and dry out the beer if you don't want something that's super sweet. Did someone say barley wine? Yes. Oh, we got a couple questions here. Let's respond to those real quick before moving on. How much chip malt do we use in a 5-gallon batch? Kind of depends on what you're going for. If you're using, for something like a New England style IPA, you could use up to a pound. The reason that I like chit is because it's got the same bodybuilding qualities as Carapils, but where Carapils is glassified, so it's basically starches that aren't quite small enough to be sugars, just like a caramel malt, but not quite caramelized yet. It's glassified carbons, basically. And what that does is it gives you kind of a flat, puffy mouth profile, which isn't really that good. And so I use chit because chit is high protein and under-modified. So it has a lot of the same starches, a lot of the same dextrins that build body and head retention, but it also has a nice graininess that complements a lot of beers. So it creates a more interesting profile. In terms of percentage, chit, I would probably use about a pound, which for a New England IPA is just a little bit under 10%. But you can go more for light beers. Like when I did my session IPA, I used I think 20% chit malt, just because the grain bill was less, and that turned out really good. And I saw someone ask about acid malts early on. I actually never use acid malt in percentage. The reason being the acidity, the lactic acid that's on there is going to be highly soluble. So you can assume that a higher percentage of the acid from acid malt will get into your beer instead of when you're calculating percentages where you're calculating based on efficiency. So if you're using a malt for like the sugar content, for example, usually a percentage will work pretty well because you want to know how much total sugar you're going to get off it relative to the total sugar of the beer. Whereas things like roasted malts, I never use percentages, and acid malts, I never use percentages, because you're looking for total amount that's going to go into your beer, and it's a different ratio because they're more soluble. They don't need to go through a process to become soluble. So in terms of acid malt, I usually use around a quarter of a pound for most of my 5-gallon batches. But some people says, I've heard that Munich malt is good in a New England IPA for balance. Is it real? I mean, I've seen it. It's not bad. It can add interestingness. But that said, I don't use a lot of Munich malt in mine. I would rather get interestingness from like different adjunct grains. And so I might use flaked rye, for example, or triticale. Chit has a lot of great graininess. Or I'll just use a more complex base malt. I think that Halcyon, which is one of my favorite base malts, would be a great base for a New England IPA. So that'd be a good thing to use. All right, going on to the next enzyme we have. We talked about AMG. We've talked about Viscobuster. We've talked about OptiMash. Let's talk about ClarityFerm. ClarityFerm is an enzyme that breaks down proteins and glutens during fermentation. So you actually add it when you add your yeast, and it ends up resulting in an overall clear beer. So it was originally used just as a clarifier to co-pitch with your yeast and end up with a beer that's going to be bright and clean. But it turns out it also dramatically reduces the gluten content. And so a lot of people lately have been using it for gluten-reduced beers. That's not something that we really focus on here because if you walk in, we've got grains wide open everywhere. So we tell people if you're really sensitive to gluten, walking in here probably just isn't a good idea. That said, ClarityFerm does come in really, really handy when you're trying to do a lager or lager type beer, a really clear beer, relatively fast, first of all, or with more interesting or high adjunct grains. Those high adjunct grains, obviously they're going to have a lot of proteins and they're going to have a lot of things in them that make it so that the beer is going to turn out hazy. So it's going to be hard for you to get a clear beer out of them. But if you use ClarityFerm, it breaks those down and drops them bright. We are actually using ClarityFerm in a lager experiment that we have going on, which we are trying to do a raw lager. We'll let you know how it goes. But basically, the idea behind doing this raw lager is zyme at every possible junction during the entire brew process. And so we obviously use the OptiMash and Viscobuster in the mash. Then during fermentation, we use ClarityFerm. And then later into fermentation, we used AMG. And then finally, we finished the whole thing off with clarifiers. So the idea is to use all these enzymes to take care of the work that mechanical different breakdown would do just going through a boil. So we'll let you know how that goes. But ClarityFerm is another really awesome enzyme that is, it's good to have around. Because why not? A raw lager, yeah, it is neat. I'll be excited if we can pull it off. We ended up using the Lutra yeast too. Our groundwater is really, really warm right now. And so getting straight into the fermenter from the mash tun is kind of a slow process. But we just pumped it in at around 100 degrees so that we didn't have to worry about our groundwater temperature. And then we're using it with the Lutra Quake yeast, which is supposedly a super neutral quake. So far, it tastes really good, but we'll have to see how it turns out. How amounts of enzymes per 5-gallon batch for Hazies? Hazies, I don't use a lot of enzymes. You can use the OptiMash. I wouldn't use the Viscobuster. But yeah, it's a small amount. For the OptiMash, I'd probably use like 5 mils. How long did it take me to grow out that sweet stash? Not very long. My mustache grows fast. Are enzymes efficient when using quike yeast? Yes. Yes, they are. It depends on what enzymes, and it depends on why you're using them. But yeah, they still work. And quike isn't going to completely dry everything out. A lot of people think that quike is like super, super attenuating, like a Brett strain would be. But it is high attenuating, but it's not going to give you a brute, for example. All right, so before we move on to topic number 2, I just want to quickly touch on other things that we've been using kind of a lot lately. And one of those is nutrients. And so we've been exploring the world of nutrients lately because there's so many out there, and it's kind of confusing which ones to use when. And so what we have is we have Fermade O, Fermade K, we have a generic nutrient, and we also have GoFirm, which is the same as Firm Start. And that's like a yeast starting nutrient that's really good for dry dehydrated yeasts. And then we have just generic DAP. So diammonium phosphate is a nitrogen compound that yeast use during fermentation, and it is basically it amounts to yeast food. Now, a lot of beers are pretty good with just what comes from beer. Beer is a high nutrient growth medium for yeast, whereas wine or mead or hard seltzer especially is not. So my general recommendation is if you're going to use nutrient for most beers, I use a little bit of Fermade K at the very beginning. And then if it's a high alcohol beer, I'll use more Fermade K, and I'll use a yeast energizer, which is the same as nutrient Vite End from Cellar Science. So that yeast energizer I'll add with more nutrient about halfway through fermentation. But for things like doing hard seltzers, your yeast will actually rely on the nutrients that's in there to produce good flavors overall. So what we like to do for the seltzers that we had for our trials is we actually built up the entire nutrient profile, and we added the Fermade O and DAP, and we also planned on adding more Fermade O and that yeast energizer during fermentation. So just wanted to touch on those. They're good things to have on hand if you wanted to play around with meads and then also doing hard seltzers. Water profile suggestion for a Yuengling clone. It's been a while since I've had Yuengling, but I would basically go with a Vienna style lager profile, which is going to be generally not super minerally, and you might lean a little bit heavy on chlorides, but overall it'll be pretty balanced. I'd keep everything below 50 parts per million for a Yuengling clone. The more neutral, the better. Do I pH buffer with the sugar type brews? I'm guessing you're meaning seltzers. I don't worry about it, or at least I haven't. That said, if I had more alkaline water, I probably would. I've heard mixed stories. So some of the nutrients I've heard work at a higher pH, but obviously a lot of the yeasts that you use work at a lower pH. So it's probably a good idea, but I haven't had any problem making good seltzers without adjusting pH, and so for now I'm not going to worry about it. Although a sour seltzer sounds like a good idea, and I think it might be something that we do in the near future. Will the shop ever sell yeast nutrient or water chemistry all in one pack? Good question. That'd take some thinking and some planning, but I can only say maybe so far. All right, let's go on to topic number 2. Topic number 2 is going to be advice on starting a brewery. So for those of you who don't know, the brewery genus right now is the 3rd brand that I've opened. And I've worked with a lot of breweries that have been a part of opening in the last 7-8 years now. So it's a topic that I am very familiar with and have had a lot of frustrations with. And it's a topic that I think has changed a lot in recent years. And I think it's a good topic to talk about right now because with all of coronavirus shutdowns and everything that's happening, I feel like in the very near future, there could be a lot of real estate property that is going for cheap. And so if you are thinking about starting a brewery, feel free to leave some questions, and let's just jump into, I think, the first and most important thing that comes with starting a brewery, and that's going to be finding a location. A lot of people that are starting breweries, at least in my area, they're starting large-scale breweries and trying to attack distro or local distro, or they're starting very, very small, kind of like we are, attacking neighborhood neighborhood taproom kind of scene. So that's two different strategies, and I think that they're both definitely viable. Let's start with the large scale. Going into the large scale, if you're going to start a large scale brewery, I think that one thing that you've got to consider is where your local market's at. Your local market is the number one place to try to penetrate when coming into a larger scale brewery, because I think going into distro, especially right now, like widespread distro, is a bad idea. And if you have the money on that, I think the money can be better spent on a quality tap room or a place for people to come and give you those higher profit margins and have fun locally versus getting out and trying to sell at a lower profit margin to other states or stores and stuff like that. That said, I think the best thing that you can do for starting a brewery, especially if you're on a budget, is actually start a small scale tap room or neighborhood style brewery. Which is what we did. So let's talk about some strategies. And if you guys have any strategies that you want to, throw out there, go over, leave them in the comments. We can discuss this. It's kind of boring when I don't have my my right hand confidant bouncing stuff off of me. So the more discussion-y this can be, the better. When you're starting a small scale neighborhood brewery, the number one thing that I think people look over and don't actually think about is just finding a place that is either up and coming or high traffic and high visibility, because that's going to be your number one. That's going to be your number one marketing scheme. There's a couple of breweries that have opened up in the last 4 years that found tap rooms that were a really, really great price. They could get in and be selling for less than $2,000 a month for their rent, but that came at the cost of street visibility and walking traffic. So one thing that we have going for us here that I think does a really awesome job at marketing without us needing to be super good at marketing is we actually have a walking and biking trail right behind us. We also have neighborhoods that are, just corners away, and a lot of places that you can walk, ride your bike from, and get to the tap room basically as easily and accessibly as possible. The one other thing is that, sorry, I'm trying to get distracted by working on my computer at the same time. But one other thing is street visibility. The first location that we were in, actually 4 years ago when we started the brewery side of this, so when we actually started brewing, had a small scale tap room, didn't put a lot into the tap room, and then the location that we were in was actually tucked back behind another business. It was in a little strip mall shopping area that didn't have a lot of traffic by itself, and then it wasn't visible from the street. So just being visible from the street, probably 30% of the new people that I see come in every week, they mention that they've seen us hundreds of times just driving by but haven't stopped in yet. And so that's telling me that a really, really large chunk of people who are coming in because they can see us driving by. So street visibility is, I think, way, way more important than saving $500 a month on rent or something. Yes, I am drinking glycol. Is reusing yeast a strategy for a small tap room? Reusing yeast is a strategy for a small tap room. That said, what I like to do with mine is I actually build mine up from smaller batches. And so if I use 3-barrel, for example, I might make a 5-gallon starter and then put that into a 1-barrel batch and then put that into a 3-barrel batch. On the 3-barrel batch, I always, or even on the small scale, I always strategize my scalings up or my reusing of yeast. And so if I know I'm going to want to use the yeast 2 or 3 times, I'll actually make the lightest beer first and then go a heavier beer and then an even heavier beer or a hoppier beer, something like that. And I wouldn't use it after any aggressive beer without a proper lab and a proper way to make sure that your yeast is still viable and healthy. Thoughts on a tap room only and building out a brewery on owned property at a separate location versus on site? That is a great way to save money, honestly. So there's a couple people in town that brew at their house. One thing that you have to know when you get into that is actually looking at the licensing, because there's some districts, at least in my city, that don't allow people to own or run businesses at all on the property. So depending on where you're at, that might be an issue. But if you can get it done legally, spending more money on the actual taproom site, especially if you're in a relatively small area. Like, let's say you can only afford 2,000 square feet, for example. Maximizing that 2,000 square feet for comfort and for, seating, ambiance, things that are going to make people happy when they're in the brewery, I think is way more important than being able to try to fit your brew house in there. I think that's a really good idea. That said, ultimately, it'd be nice if you can just go big and, have enough room that you can fit the brewery in there and fit the taproom in comfortably. We're a 25,000 or 2,500 square foot spot here. Plus we have another 1,200 square foot patio. And even then there's times where I think this is a little cramped. Granted, we have to fit a homebrew supply store in here as well, but definitely saving room if you're on a budget is a great way to do it, as long as you can get the right spot. And that comes into play a lot because I know there's a lot of like high traffic 16 to 1,700 square foot areas, and we wouldn't want to try to fit a brewery in there because you'd be wasting a lot of valuable seating area. In the process of starting a non-distro 5-barrel brewery in a small town in Vancouver Island. It's seaside and no other breweries in town. Oh, nice. That sounds awesome. Just waiting on the bank to get back at this point and have a location. We are ready to go. Money has been harder to get with the whole COVID thing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. People, stop calling me. 1 second. I got it half muted. Yeah, so one thing that is hard, I actually have a friend who's in the process of starting a brewery and had everything sorted out, but got to that kind of hold up with financing and like was ready to pull the trigger on everything, but financing being pushed back. Obviously, banks are busy right now. A lot of banks are funding things with PPP and everything. And so a lot of their attention is focused on, relief funds and not so much on like small business loans or something like that, especially if you're going with the SBA loan, Small Business Administration. An SBA loan, SBA is probably so backed up right now. Thinking about getting a license and starting an ultra small, like boutique batches that I sell by the bottle/case and only for extra pocket money, not full employment, just paying for my hobby. There is actually a brewery in this city that does 5-gallon batches. And what they did is they actually just put a little tap room in their bar or in their in their house, not in their house, in their the barn area on the side of their house. But it's a super cool idea, and they only open 1 day a week. They're like, we're not trying to make money, not trying to be a super operating tap room or anything like that. But they make way more than enough to cover their expenses on brewing. They get to make beer and they get to be a part of the beer community for a relatively small price. So I think it's a really cool idea. If you ever try to make a lot of money on it, obviously it's not gonna work super well, but it's a super cool idea. And then you're in it for just the love of owning a brewery at that point. The green stuff in my water jug is Slurm. Yes. No, it's just electrolytes. All right, let's get back to themes when it comes to starting a brewery. So we've talked about this before. We've actually Logan and I riffed a little bit on ideas for starting a brewery on one of our earlier live streams. But one thing that we think is really important is actually having a niche. A lot of people start a brewery just, hey, we're going to make good beer. And whether or not you make good beer is one thing. Obviously, good beer is going to sell itself. But niching down, that can be niching in terms of the type of beer that you make, like the beer that you want to be good at. There's a couple of breweries in town who just niched onto IPAs, and all they make is IPAs, and people go crazy for them because IPAs are super popular. And there's a couple of other breweries that niched down onto sours. We're one of those. We get a lot of people coming in just asking for sours, and that's another way to get a community that's always going to consistently like your beer, which is a really good thing because if the people that are constantly coming in are coming in because you have the style that they like, then that's also going to give your ratings a boost because people are going to be coming in for your style of beer. You're going to be making that style of beer. They're going to like it. They're going to rate your establishment highly, and that works. Another way to niche is actually niche in terms of theme, and that's something that not a lot of people, I think, do well. I know there's a lot of breweries that are bigger scale that really niche into the outdoors theme, and I think that's a super broad but also super relatable way to connect with people. I know breweries that have niched into like motorcycles. There's a brewery pretty close to us that niched into Dungeons and Dragons, which that's a cool way to do it. But coming up with a theme, I think, is a super important way to connect with a specific demographic or audience, while not necessarily alienating other people. The only problem is it's really hard to do. You got to be very consistent with it, and you can't be so hyper focused on it that, like I said, you're alienating other people. So it's one thing to have an idea for a niche and be like, oh, this is our theme, we're going to name all our beers off of it. And it's another to actually execute that in a way that draws in people within your niche, without excluding other people. Been super curious about my take on plate chillers. The cleaning is such a pain, makes you wonder if it's really worth it. Yeah, plate chillers are the most efficient way on the large scale to have a heat exchanging unit. That said, a lot of people that have plate chillers, even on the large scale, never take them apart. They just run hot caustic through them and hope it works. On the small scale, I would say 5 gallons, maybe even 10 gallons and less. I would never think it's worth it to get a plate chiller. I have a counterflow, but when we're brewing on our large scale, we'll use counterflow chillers. Whenever we're brewing on a small scale, an immersion chiller works just fine. And honestly, there's stuff that's easier for you to do. For example, hop stands. Those are easier for you to do with a immersion chiller versus a plate chiller. So 10 gallons, maybe even 15 gallons and under, I'd probably still go with an immersion chiller. They're easier to store, easier to set up. They don't need a pump. Whereas a plate chiller, you can say you don't need a pump, but you do need a pump if you ever want to do any like hop stands. The two enzymes that I was talking about earlier were ViscoBuster and OptiMash. OptiMash is the other one. They're both sold by White Labs. OptiMash is the same as like if you had Amylex 4T, and then there's a larger scale enzyme making company that I just used, that I forget their name, and I don't know what theirs is. All right, so next let's talk about budget versus labor. And budget versus labor is something that it should be very, very telling when it comes to what size brewery you start up. So a lot of people say that they're going to start up like, let's say a 1 barrel or 2 barrel or a 3 barrel brewery, and they're fine with that because when they cost everything out, they don't look at their own labor as, a cost. And so they're like, oh, it's going to be easy to make money. The problem with that is, and I did this myself at the very beginning when I opened up the business, I put a lot of my labor into actually running the business or being the man on duty, being the shopkeeper, being the brewer, being the bartender, whatever, doing all of that, which meant I didn't have time to be the brand builder. And being the brand builder is actually probably the biggest thing when it comes to opening up a brewery. And so the biggest you can possibly open up with, or the biggest scale, if you can plan for those extra sales or put yourself in a position to get those extra sales with the money, then the more you'll have to put into building a team that's going to make it so that your job of building the brand is going to be easier. Even if you want to be the brewer, it'd be a good idea to go big enough that you can actually afford to have an assistant brewer / bartender or someone you can kind of spread other tasks around to. It'd also be important to open up big enough that, for a while I had to do all the bookkeeping, for example. Thinking of my other business. My other business only has a team of like 5 people. And so, we really had to have one person that was good at each aspect of that, on that team, or else the whole thing just didn't run. And it made it really, really hard for all of us to spread around that workload. So I think 3 barrels is probably the smallest size that I think is feasible for a neighborhood tap room if you want to do anything other than brewing and bartending. 3 barrels is plenty that you can hire an assistant brewer that can also, maybe take off, when you have a recipe dialed in and you've showed that person the ropes, they can take the load of doing some of those batches of beer. and then also work a couple of bartending shifts so that you yourself can get out and network with the community. You can do your brand building. You can make acquaintances that might be willing to like pitch in free labor. When you're part of a community, sometimes people will come in and be like, hey, by the way, if you need help with this one thing, that's something that I can do. And just, making those connections and being a part of the community and getting out there, I think is really important. So when you think about opening up a brewery, make sure that you're not seeing yourself as the person who's doing all the odd jobs. All right, let's see what else we got. Where do we make the most money, from the homebrew shop or from the bar sales? We make the most money from selling beer. So we're in a position right now where the sales of the beer and the sales from the shop are relatively comparable. The nice thing about that, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. So obviously when it comes to having the beer to put on to consistently sell beer and make the most money, which we do make the most money on beer, there's a lot more labor that goes into getting that part of it done. A labor that goes into brewing, that goes into cleaning tanks, that goes into kegging and keg management. If we ever have to deliver kegs, obviously selling and delivering kegs is a big part of running a brewery too. So there's labor that goes into that. And there's relatively less labor that goes into, buying and selling stuff, but obviously that margin's going to be lower. Now, the headache when it comes to the homebrew supply store, the buying and selling stuff, is there's a lot of inventory to manage. And so if it's not consistently taken care of, or if we're not on top of it all the time, then it becomes a really, really big headache when we have to count everything and make sure that what we think we have in stock is in stock. At the end of the year, if we have to write off things to theft or damage, or maybe we just used something and forgot to ring it up. So it's a double-edged sword. It's good that I have both, but in terms of what actually makes the most money, selling beer makes the most money. If I wanted to brew on an existing brewery system and sell it at my separately owned tap room, how should I go about that licensing? So you actually don't even need a TTB license to do that. It's called contract brewing. It is possible to own a brand and be a brewery. So if what you are is a contract brewery, that does need a TTB license. But if you're just basically a brand buying and selling beer as your own brand, you can actually do that without the federal licensing part of it. But what you're basically trying to do is contract brewing, and there's two different ways. The licensing is going to depend on the state you're in. It's very, very different in Washington than it is pretty much anywhere else. But what I would do is I would take a look, first of all, at the TTB, look up contract brewing and seeing if what you want to do fits under what the TTB is going to need you to license. And then I would look into the state licensure. First step is going to be starting a business, though, which you start a business, at least in Washington, you start a business through your state Department of Revenue. And a lot of times your Department of Revenue will actually, at least in Washington, walk you through the other steps you'll need to take to get that done. Will we make a pumpkin beer? Nah. We've made pumpkin beers before, but pumpkin beers are so overdone these days that I don't want to touch it. I am much more likely to make a sweet potato beer for the fall as my fall seasonal, or a chai beer, even though chai is kind of getting overdone too, than a pumpkin beer. What are your thoughts about starting a brewery in these times? I think it's a good time as long as you're starting a neighborhood brewery. Even though everything's getting shut down, there are going to be some properties going for cheaper in the near future, or probably already. And there's going to be a lot of shutdowns, so places to look for. There's also a lot of development, at least in my area. And so if you're starting a neighborhood brewery, I would look at areas that are relatively cheap right now, but that are going to be developed in the near future. I have a friend that actually, is a regular part of the city council or something. So he's actually someone who can tell me when areas are about to get developed or gentrified. Those are usually good areas to start with because they're going to be taking relatively rundown areas that has cheap property. They're going to be putting money into those properties. And so if you're one of the businesses that's going to occupy that, you might actually be able to get some sort of aid or grants. And then they're going to be turning it into an area with high walking traffic. So I think it's a good time to start a brewery. I think it's a terrible time to start a brewery if you're trying to distribute at all. Because obviously there's no sports. There's no things that people are going there. You can't go to bars. So But that said, the bubble is definitely getting burst, and so the competition might be going relatively down in the distro market in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Do you use different lager yeast for a different type of lager? Helles versus a Dunkel versus a Martin. Yes, we do actually. Anything that's going to be kind of bright and minerally, maybe with a little bit of a sulfur touch, we like to use Urkel yeast. Anything that's going to be a little bit more malt leaning, if it's going to be like fruity and malty, 3470 is definitely a good way to go. That can also be pretty nice and neutral, but it's going to give some perception of the malt flavor with just a touch of that Bavarian fruitiness. And then Harvest kind of does the same thing, but it's a good all-rounder. Harvest is definitely still malt leaning, but it has a lot of those kind of sulfury notes, or some brightness that if you wanted to do like let's say a Maibach, where you want those hops to kind of pop off just a little bit, I think Harvest works pretty well for that too. I design mobile apps. Do you need any? Maybe. I don't know. Looking to start my own brewery one day, but don't have any pro brewing experience. Should I work / volunteer? So yeah, I know a lot of people who have started breweries without any pro brewing experience, and there's a huge learning curve with it when it comes to big equipment. So I guess I would say that depends on your size. For how we brew downtown, pro brewing experience is definitely handy because there's a lot of technical things that come with the equipment that just knowing how to troubleshoot that helps a lot. For how we brew here, pro brewing experience would help, but as long as you're open-minded and willing to be learning, you could brew how we brew here, I would say pretty simply if you're a good home brewer, and then learn as you go and not make too many mistakes. Do you think it's a good idea to get some experience? But that said, if you're networked, if you're a good part of a community, then you can probably have people that are going to help you troubleshoot different things and help you learn as you go. Been looking for a Genus tank tops in big boy sizes. Any updates? I don't know if we put those on the website yet. I'll take a look after this and I'll get some up on the website. Plastic fermenter, clean, super good, and Star San, smells sour. Throw some boiling water in it. And if it still smells, then I would probably go boiling water and baking soda. Plastic fermenters are tough. I'm not a huge fan of them just because they are difficult to clean, and I'd never buy a used plastic fermenter. But yeah, I would boiling water first just to make sure that you're killing off everything, and then baking soda would be probably the best for deodorizing. You can always caustic it to get deep in there too. Are cert programs like Sable worth the time / money for homebrewers with no professional brewing experience looking for a brewing job? I think it's just as good these days to get into the industry through brewing. That said, I know somebody who started a brewery and went down to the UC Davis program right after starting a brewery and came back with a ton of great knowledge, and he makes really good beer. So I'm not going to say that they're not worth it. I just think that I think it depends on the type of person that you are. If you're relatively savvy and you're an aggressive learner, you're someone who likes to really get out there and engage, and try to grow as a brewer, as a person, then I think that you can probably get by with just trying to teach yourself everything. But for some people, they're very much book study. They need that, that expert advice, which there's nothing wrong with. But they, for them, probably something like Sable or a brewing program would be good. There are colleges that have whole degrees in that stuff now. What's the next trend for IBAs? Went from very hoppy and bitter to juicy to milkshake. Brute was in there for a hot minute. So I think the current trend that we're seeing right now is low-cal IPAs, because you can make low-cal beer taste more like beer if it's an IPA and you put a lot of fruitiness or juiciness into it. So low-cal I think is definitely up there. That said, I would say like hyper fruited or maybe even sour IPAs. It's hard to really tell. I think we might end up going back to West Coast, so that West Coast style pretty soon. All right. I have one more. I had a couple of like things. I think we kind of covered them in the Q&As. But one more thing when it comes to starting a brewery, just a quick rundown on the legal stuff. There's two parts to starting a brewery, and one is going through the federal government for your TTB approval. That is probably going to take the longest part. That said, you can't start that unless you already have a UBI from your state government. So if you're thinking about starting it and you want the general rundown, state government comes first. You have to start a business, get a UBI. Then you can get an EIN with your UBI, which is federal government, and then you can go through the TTB to apply for your brewing endorsement there. And then your state government is probably going to want you to already have you can start the state licensure, but your state government is probably going to want you to have your TTB completed before they start looking at your application for your state licensure. So if you're thinking about that and you're in America, that's how it's done. What recipe should a first pro brew be? That's a great question. First pro brew, I would say it's probably the one that you're going to mess up the most, but I would say make a lager. If you can make a nice clean lager on your first pro system, then you can pretty much make everything, because that's making sure that you're taking care of yeast health. That's making sure that you can run your system well and cleanly. They're also relatively inexpensive to make, so if something goes wrong, it's not like a terrible dump. And then after that, I would start ramping up with things that are either high protein or high hops, just to make sure that you know where things might get clogged in your system. And I might even say do something like a stout, like an oatmeal stout, because that's going to be relatively high in terms of hops and protein, and they're still relatively cheap compared to like doing a double IPA. But then you can see if those hops are going to clog anything up. You can see in your system where you might be able to whirlpool better to get that trub to settle out before going through your chillers and pumps. You can kind of brainstorm where you might be able to, like on our system downtown, we actually take something from our boil and then we can run it through the mash tun to kind of filter out extra proteins and hops and then run it through our chiller. So you can figure out like small tweaking stuff like that. So I would say lager first and then maybe something with high protein stuff. Yeah, any more questions? If not, I'm going to go ahead and get this shut down so that we can get opened up. Hope you enjoyed my solo live stream. I think I'm going to be solo again next week unless I can get a guest commentator here. I'll see what I find out. It's definitely a lot easier to live stream when you got two people, because then I can take drinks of glycol without long awkward pauses. Or do some research. How much fermenter space does y'all have? Here we've got one 5-barrel fermenter, a 4-barrel fermenter that's about to go away. We have two 2-barrel fermenters and one 1-barrel fermenter. Downtown we use one 7-barrel fermenter and one 7-barrel bright tank. Every double act needs a straight man. Well, that's presumptuous. Does Invertase have a flavor threshold? Couldn't find any info on it. I don't know the answer to that. I imagine it does. Most enzymes do, but and they're usually relatively low, but I don't know what they are. Off topic, but can I leave a beer in primary fermenter for 1 month? Yeah, that's fine. Depends on what it is. If you have a lot of hops in there, get them off the hops as soon as possible. If there's not a lot of hops, then yeah, it's totally fine. Have we done research on Brett/plant associations for inoculating with Brett from a wild source? The vast majority of fruits will be, what's the word? Not codependent, but cohabitating with Brett. Brett's the most common yeast that you find in the wild. And so if you have, for example, crushed apples that not spontaneously ferment, there's a good chance that it's Brett. It could be something else, but there's a good chance that it's Brett, because that's the stronger survivor of the two. The only real way to know, though, is ferment something small and then streak it out and figure out what you got. All right, I think that's all the questions. I'm going to go ahead and get opened up. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you haven't already, thumbs up this video before I shut it off. And I'll see you next week. Bum, bum.